A lot of people are very obsessed with being perceived as moral. And by moral, I basically mean good and righteous. And this heavily gets in the way of them achieving their financial goals. And I'm about to deliver you a message that is pretty unconventional and is going to paint me in perhaps a pretty bad light, but it is the truth, and you need to hear it if you are a young man and you want to get rich and you want to make a lot of money. Because what you think is right and righteous and moral is subjective to you. Now, there's obvious things that you shouldn't do, like, you probably shouldn't murder people, you probably shouldn't commit genocide, you probably shouldn't. There's all sorts of bad things that we know basically not to do. But in business and in the discipline of commercial transaction, you sometimes have to be a little bit immoral to get what you want and to get rich. And I'm not talking about like purposely screwing people over. I'm just talking about challenging your basic moral compass. Let me give you a story. When I started my first business, I started a marketing agency. And in order for me to succeed with that marketing agency, I had to acquire clients. I had to call up people and I had to ring them up and basically say, hey, I want to sell you my services, would you like to buy them? And I quickly learned through doing a few sales calls through this marketing agency that I had to become pretty relentless and ruthless with people on the phone in order to sign them up as clients. And I was 18 when I started doing this, and so I was quite soft and I was a bit of a pussy basically. And I didn't like to push people and I felt bad for pressuring people. And what I learned is that the only real way to get people to buy my services was to put them in pain and pressure. And so what I started doing on sales calls was asking them questions that I knew would create pain. So like, for example, if they were struggling to get more customers for their business, I'd say to them, like, what does this mean for your family? What does this mean for your personal life? How is this going to have an impact on the future of your livelihood? And I knew by asking questions like that that it would cause them to suffer, which would in turn cause them to be more motivated to buy my services. And I thought that that was immoral. And for a long time, I stood on my high horse and I told myself, no, I'm a man of principle and I'm not going to sacrifice my morals or put people in pain or anything like that to get what I want. And I realized that was wrong, because the truth is that if I could actually help this person, which I could, then sometimes they needed to be in pain in order to do that. So when I'm talking about being immoral, I'm not talking about like letting go of your, base, like the righteous value systems that you hold. Like, you shouldn't murder people, you shouldn't scam people, you shouldn't steal from people, all these things, right? But there are things in business where there is a gray area of morality. And there are things that you're going to have to do in business to get rich that might make you feel a little uncomfortable. But what I can tell you is that the most successful entrepreneurs that I know have no problem being absolutely brutally ruthless with their dealings. Because if you want to get rich, you're going to have to beat people and you're going to have to crush people, because you're going to be competing with people and you're going to have to, act out in the world and do things that basically make other people suffer. And what I mean by that is you're going to have to take clients away from your competitors, you're going to have to poach people from your competitors. And a lot of civilians, and when I say civilian, I just mean non-entrepreneur human, they would look at the actions of the top entrepreneurs in the world and consider them to be immoral. And that's fine, but here's the thing. You can either be like moral and you can have this like high horse status of yourself, of like sitting on your high horse and saying, oh, I wouldn't do that because I'm moral, or you can be rich. Let me give you an example. A while ago, someone made a video about me. I didn't know who it was until a bunch of people sent me the video. And in this video, this person, I don't know this guy, so I hadn't heard of him before the video. But he made this video and he was talking about me and saying how like I'm a big scammer because I sell a course or something like that, right? And it was basically like I didn't watch the whole thing because it was way too long. I watched like 10 minutes. It was a whole rant about me and how I was like this big scammer and this big like, guru, like promising people the world and all this stuff, which is fine, like it's his opinion, right? Whatever. It's a very emotional video. And during the video, he said something along the lines of, I would never do what Charlie does because I am a moral person. So his whole argument was basically, because I sell a course, I'm a scammer, and therefore I'm immoral. Now I didn't watch the whole video, so there's probably a lot more to it than that, and I'm sure that he might think differently about that. But it really, I really had to smile at it, because basically what this guy was saying is, Charlie's rich and I'm not, because basically apparently we're competitors, right? He was saying Charlie's rich and I'm not, because Charlie's willing to do immoral things that I'm not willing to do. So I am fundamentally good, and that is why he's beating me. And that's a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about here, where people, they would rather seem like a good person than be rich. And I can tell you, I know people who are worth 9 figures, multi-9 figures. I know a couple of billionaires, spoken to them before. They are not good people. They are insofar as, they're nice to their families, and they're not going to kill people or murder people. They're morally just, right? But when it comes to business and when it comes to commercial transaction, they are completely, utterly ruthless in their pursuits. And I've seen this not just in business, but I've seen it in history as well. So throughout reading books about history and seeing stories throughout history of conquerors and stuff like that, you look at any great person, anyone that you look up to, whether that's in business, whether that's in life, whether that's throughout history, commercially, whatever. And if you really look at their biographies and you read what people had to say about them, you will find really sometimes immoral practices. Now, not immoral as far as the extreme, but doing bad things. Like, for example, let's take Andrew Carnegie, who was basically the richest man in America when JP Morgan bought his company in the 1800s. And Andrew Carnegie basically built his fortune by insider trading. Now, insider trading by today's modern moral standards is considered very evil and very bad, and it's literally illegal. So if you trade off of inside information and you off public companies, then you can go to prison or be fined for that, right? Andrew Carnegie, what he did, which is brilliant, is he worked for a large railway company in his 20s, and because it was in Pittsburgh, right? So it's a big railway town, steel town. And Andrew Carnegie, he basically knew, because in the 1800s, one of the main priorities of the US government was basically putting railroads throughout the entirety of the US, because the US is obviously a massive country, and they realized that the whole manifest destiny move to the West thing was only possible if people could actually get there, which is why railways were basically built. And Andrew Carnegie, working for one of the largest railway companies in the 1800s, as a young man, he knew where the railways were going to be placed. And so he had this foresight, this inside information in the company, knowing full well where these railways were going to be built. And what Andrew Carnegie did, because it was legal at the time, but many people would consider this immoral in the financial gaze these days, is because he knew where the railways were going to be built, he could predict where the towns and the cities of the future were going to crop up. Because the only place that a settlement can be developed is a place where people can access, and the only way people can access it is through a railway, unless you fancy getting a horse and carriage through Texas, which people did in those days, right? They tried, but a lot died. And so what he would do is geniusly, if that's even a word, he would buy up the land along the railways and where settlements would be most best placed. So near rivers or water access points or wherever it was safest, right? And so he would buy up the land, lots of land deals, and he would then wait, 10 years, and then he would sell that land back to the government or the landlords or whatever at a massive premium, because land those days was quite cheap because it wasn't settled. So if he knew, okay, in 3 years' time, this railway is going to run through this valley, which means that Colorado is going to exist in 100 years, right? He bought that land, and by a lot of standards, that's immoral. And we look at the same examples of, another example of the same timeline is John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil, who's, basically built like modern oil. When he started, there were, hundreds, maybe not hundreds, like a bunch of oil companies, and now there's like one or two, right? But what John D. Rockefeller would do is he would basically he would purposefully sabotage and destroy these small mom and pop oil things so he could build his monopoly. Immoral. Another example, let's take Jeff Bezos with Amazon. We've all heard about the working conditions of the Amazon factories. And a lot of people, they love to go on social media and talk about how, you know, awful it is that Amazon pays their people so little and they have to work too much and all that stuff. But Jeff Bezos is one of the richest men in the world and people still use Amazon. Like, the point I'm making here, Nietzsche put this beautifully. People care less about being moral. They care a lot more about seeming moral. And so what people love to do is they love to virtue signal. And it was funny because I was in a cafe last summer. I was in Oxford in the UK. And I was in this cafe and, you know, I was this a university town, so one of these like left-wing woke towns, right? Not that Oxford's that left-wing, but there was this girl sat in this cafe and she had a MacBook. And on that MacBook, there was all these little woke virtue signaling stickers. And one of them was something like stop child labor, and like it was all about these African mines and like stop this, stop that, stop child labor, stop like exploiting children and stuff for commercial gain. And I couldn't help myself, right? So I went, I don't do this often, right? But I couldn't help myself because I was curious about this weird dichotomy, because like she's got a fucking MacBook, for God's sake. Like her whole like virtue identity on the back of her MacBook was about how people shouldn't exploit children in mines, which is basically Apple's business model, right? There's a bit more to it than that, but Apple as a tech company wants to find the most efficient and profitable way to source raw materials for its goods. And would you imagine that they're going to do that in third world countries in places like the DMC of Africa or whatever, right? So I go over to this girl and I say like, hey, like, you know, I saw the sticker you've got on the back of your MacBook, like, you know, what's that about? And she was like, oh, like, I just think it's like awful that like people, and she sat there with a, you know, $10 coffee and, you know, her high horse. Like, I just think it's awful that, you know, I just can't believe that like all these corporations just like, you know, they may make people, they exploit people and showing us around. I said, but you do realize that the very device that you're tweeting about that on is quite literally the product of that labor. And you can imagine the reaction that invoked, which was quite amusing. But, you know, people care more about seeming moral than they actually do. Like, true morality is acted out. And, you know, a lot of these top entrepreneurs, they have no shame in doing things that most people consider immoral. And a lot of entrepreneurs are perfectly content with being seen as not immoral, but they don't care about being seen as good guys. They just don't. They care about winning and they care about succeeding, because when we look at like conquerors or, you know, the greatest like military minds throughout history, they didn't care about what the public thought of them or whether people thought they were good or bad. They just cared about winning. And there's a stretch to this. You don't want to be, you know, evil. You don't want to be malicious. You don't want to scam people, you know. But just take a look at this industry and look at some of the most successful people in this make money online industry, and look at their reputations and look at their product quality and go on Reddit and see what people say about them. And you might find some skeletons in the closet, but they don't care because they're making so much fucking money. All right? So the point I'm making here is just think before you sit on your high horse. You can either be rich and seem perfectly moral and an angel of heaven. You can either be poor, but you can be seen to yourself and others as this angel of heaven that wouldn't dare do anything bad ever because you're so afraid of people's opinion. Or you can do things that a lot of people might consider to be savage or ruthless and be rich. But you can't have both, because even the people who try to protect their reputations the most have some skeletons in the closet. So yeah, that's it. Bye. Hey, so that's the end of the video. Quick one for some of you. If you are a marketing agency and a coach or consultant and you need help getting more clients, there is a link you can click in the description. So if you're struggling to fill your pipeline, get qualified appointments and get deals over the line, click the link in the description. Full transparency, it's a video of me trying to sell you something. This is only for marketing agencies and coach consultants. So if that's not you, then you can click off and this won't be relevant to you at all. But yeah, check it out. See you soon.